All right, thank you for that introduction. And yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge that, yeah, this is something that more or less has affected everyone in this room. And if it hasn't already, it will in the future. So that being said, this presentation will be bereft of humor or levity, and I think that's just something to acknowledge up front. However, I also want to acknowledge that unlike my father, I'm a clinician, not an academic, so public speaking is something I do maybe once a year, so apologies in advance if I'm speaking a little fast. I also did treat myself to Austin's finest cold brew, which in retrospect might have been a mistake, so I will do my best to keep it slow. So I'm going to focus today on first giving a preface of who is and what are neuropsychologists, because even amongst my family, there's a lot of confusion of what we are, what we do. And I think that's an important background to say, why are we talking about this? I'll also give a little bit of background on what is relevant to the current research, and then we're going to do a deep dive, and hopefully not too deep of a dive, but a deep dive into diet as it focuses on how it relates to Alzheimer's disease. So if there aren't a lot of questions, I also do have a little bonus, and we'll talk about one of the things that I never anticipated taking up a lot of my time as a clinician, but somehow has, which is sleep. So we'll touch on that. And even though that's not the focus of today's presentation, if you want to ask questions about sleep and Alzheimer's, that's also something I typically do present on. So let's go ahead and dive in. Oh, slides are up. So we're going to be talking today about the brain and behavior, and essentially, that is what a neuropsychologist is. We study the relationship of the brain and behavior. It's a specialized field of clinical or research psychology. And what our qualifications are, we obtain a doctorate in psychology, and then we weren't done there. We do a 2-year specialized fellowship in clinical neuropsychology or research neuropsychology. So you get the doctoral degree, and then you do another 2 years on top of that, and then you are what's called board eligible. And anybody who's using the title neuropsychologist meets these criteria. So if you meet somebody who claims to be a neuropsychologist, this is their credential. So typically we're engaged in clinical practice, meaning that we're working with patients. And what that means is we also tend to hold a valid license in psychology. So what do? We do something called a neuropsychological evaluation, which is a really fancy way of saying we test people's thinking and behavior. So what is the purpose of this? Primarily, number one is to diagnose and diagnose accurately. So we identify the presence and severity of any dysfunction within the brain. We differentiate between how that may be due to an organic cause or due to something that may be reversible. And I mentioned things like sleep. Also a big one is depression. There's a term called pseudodementia, which is a fancy way of saying when depression mimics dementia. And that's a big part of why we exist. As a psychologist, we bridge the gap between neurology and psychology because there's so much confusion, which somebody who's having significant mood difficulties and memory difficulties, how much of this may be a disease process versus depression, which obviously we want to treat those quite differently. So on top of we're not just diagnosing, or else I wouldn't have much to do during the week. We're also describing neuropsychological status, which again is a long way of saying thinking and behavior. So we detail how a disease process or brain lesion is impacting an individual. And what lesion means is anything that's in the brain that shouldn't be there, whether that's a bruise, a tumor, damaged tissue. Lesion is just a term meant something that shouldn't be there, right? And how much that's having an impact on a person from a thinking standpoint, from a behavioral standpoint, and oftentimes also an emotional standpoint. And if you think, boy, there's probably a lot of overlap between those three, you're absolutely right. And so an example would be, and this is what I did for many years, is so an individual has a stroke. How much is this impacting their thinking? How are they going to be able to function on their own? Are they going to be able to return home? What level of supervision is going to be helpful? And are they going to be able to return to work? As we have younger and younger folks having strokes, this is a big factor. And even though now I work primarily with older adults, when I was working with stroke populations, that was a difficult thing to answer, right? Because different jobs require different types of thinking abilities. And how much of this is going to get better versus how much of this is going to stay the same, that's one of the more challenging things and more interesting things neuropsychologists do, I think. Let's try to answer that question. So that leads into the other thing we do, which is we involve ourselves in treatment planning and making actionable recommendations to patients and their families. So we'll specify how the findings from our evaluation suggest a particular treatment, sometimes facility placement, nursing home, skilled nursing facility, acute rehabilitation. And so that's a big part of what we do at early stages post-injury or post-event is we say, can this person tolerate participating in a therapeutic? Meaning if somebody's in the early stages of recovery from a severe traumatic brain injury, they may have minutes to seconds of memory, in which case we want to wait for that to improve a little bit before we send them somewhere where they're supposed to be learning how to do things again, right? It may not be efficient at that stage, so that's one of the things we do. We then identify the expected effects of a treatment, meaning that in that previous example, how much do we expect them to benefit from doing something like that, and how are we going to measure that? So for example, I may say, I'm going to retest this person more comprehensively 6 months from now because I anticipate there's going to be this amount of recovery, and so we're also specifying that. And then, this typically, unfortunately, is where I usually get the most questions. I'll specify, I'm not a forensic neuropsychologist, but I'll admit this is probably one of the more interesting things neuropsychologists do. We identify the extent to which a medical event resulted in damage to the brain, and then we determine if a person has decision-making capacity. And when you think of famous cases like this, where finances get involved, this is challenging. And this is why folks who do this, typically this is all they do, is operate in a forensic capacity. So I'm aware of this, I have knowledge of this, this is not something I do, and this is a complex issue, so we're not going to focus too much on that. But that is something neuropsychologists do. So a few quick questions that usually come up at this point. Well, if you're a psychologist, do you provide psychotherapy? The answer is some neuropsychologists do, though most do not. We're technically qualified to do that. However, given the roles and responsibilities of focusing on thinking, we usually offer very brief counseling for somebody who may be admitted due to an event that happened to their brain. However, more often than not, neuropsychologists are recommending folks see specialized counselors who are usually master's level clinicians who that's their focus, that's their primary orientation throughout work. So do neuropsychologists provide psychotherapy? They can, some do, most don't. What's the difference between us doing clinical practice, research, academia? The answer is most of us do a little bit of each. Some folks do all of one. Some folks split equally across the three. Me, myself, I'm a clinician currently, meaning that that's my full-time gig. However, I did teach in the past. I've done some research, which we're going to be talking about shortly. But if you meet a neuropsychologist and they don't have good research information, that doesn't mean they're a bad neuropsychologist. They just may be really focused on their clinical practice. The other thing people ask about, and we're not going to focus on this, is something called cognitive remediation, which is how do I improve my thinking, which I'm sure everybody in the room could see, boy, that's an interesting topic, right? So do we provide specific treatments? Is that what we're doing? Typically, no. Our focus is usually to diagnose and recommend you work with somebody where that's all they do. And what that may mean is a speech and language pathologist, an occupational therapist. These are folks who that's their entire goal, is to help you improve in certain aspects. And we'll often refer you to those folks, but as a neuropsychologist ourselves, we're usually focused on diagnosing and making sure you're winding up with the right clinician who does that. So some neuropsychologists do that, most do not. Okay, so we primarily, in addition to doing those evaluations, leading up to that, we also conduct comprehensive clinical interviews with patients who are referred for testing. This is making sure that we have a clear understanding of what the referral question is. These may be very specific, these may be very vague, so that's why we're typically trying to do an interview first to make sure we're in the right place. For example, recent referral questions I've been given from physicians are describe cognitive status. I have to do an interview to figure out why that is, what are they looking for. In other cases, I'll get very specific referral questions. Is this Alzheimer's disease or is this Lewy body dementia? And then I go, okay, that's going to be a very different interview, right? So that's a big part of what we're spending our time doing. So where do our referral sources come from? Primarily neurologists, primary care physicians, psychiatrists in some cases. Neurologists are the most common. We then conduct our comprehensive evaluations to answer those referral questions, and that means we administer, score, and interpret performance on neurocognitive tests. These domains are typically, as you could imagine, memory, attention abilities, one's speed of thinking, language abilities, visuospatial abilities, executive functioning, which I'll kind of define what those are and where those map to in the brain a little later. And then we also, of course, screen for mood-related factors that can affect performance on this. So I'll pause here because this is another spot where folks usually have a question is, ooh, can we take a look at those specific tests? Those sound really interesting. How do you measure those? Myself and any neuropsychologist is probably going to keep it pretty vague on that, and that's because we need to protect the security of those tests, right? Making folks familiar with what to expect if they're about to have their thinking evaluated, you imagine that could be a problem, right? So if you go to a neuropsychologist and get an evaluation done, they seem a little dry, they seem a little cold. That's because we want to keep things as vague as possible. We don't want you to have preconceived notions about how a test works or what we're looking for. So no, we're not going to get into specifics on that. I can answer some questions off mic if you're interested, but a good example of this, has anybody heard of the Rorschach test? Do people know what that is? The ink blots so if you Google Rorschach test right now, you can find each of the images and their interpretation on Wikipedia. So it's completely invalid. There's no use to it because folks can read up on it and come into your office and know exactly how you're going to interpret their answer, right? So nobody's doing Rorschachs anymore, and that's the reason why we don't give out information on our cognitive test, right? If you're exposed to what we're looking for, how we're measuring it, completely invalidates it. Which earlier, as I mentioned, if we're doing a forensic evaluation, that's a big problem, right? So we then provide feedback to patients and their family members. So once we do this evaluation, we explain first to the physician who referred us, this is what I think, and then we also explain to the patient and their family, here's what you can expect. Sometimes this is a very easy part of my job. If I say, hey, you're just a little worried, you look fine, go about your life, keep doing what you're doing. Other times this takes up a huge portion of my week. If I'm making a rare diagnosis or a confusing diagnosis or the family's expectations aren't particularly realistic. And so neuropsychologists may be doing a good amount of this, depending on the setting they work in. And then, of course, we have that report written up. If you open a medical record and look at one of these evaluations, they're usually fairly technical, fairly complex, and that's because we're writing them to the audience of a physician, right? And so a good neuropsychologist writes this fancy report, but then they talk to you about what it means and translate it. And then, of course, we also do things like what we're doing today. We present, we do didactics, case reviews, we informally consult with staff, and then we provide training, of course, to future neuropsychologists. Okay. Now that you know what a neuropsychologist is, what we do, let's get to the interesting stuff. So this diagram is meant to be a visualization of how memory works in the brain. That looks confusing, looks messy. That's because it is. And to be honest, if we were going to talk about the neuroanatomy of memory, we would probably need about a 12-hour presentation. So we're not going to do that today. But I am going to try and provide an overall simplification of functional neuroanatomy. And what that essentially means is how do specific parts of the brain map to specific functions. So different cognitive functions map to different neuroanatomical correlates, meaning different parts of the brain do different things as it comes to our thinking and our behavior, right? This is kind of hilarious. I usually have a diagram of the brain or a model of the brain I bring with me. I didn't feel like checking a bag just to bring a plastic brain with me, so in hindsight, this is a little too small, so I'm just not going to use it, but a good way to think of the brain is, and this is a big oversimplification, is if you make a fist, you can think of the brain like this. So your finger coming around here, this is your frontal lobe that's most classically associated with executive functionings. That's what differentiates us primarily from the animal kingdom. Think of this like the CEO of the brain. This is what does our complex problem solving. This is where our personalities live, where religiosity came from in the brain. So, of course, massive interest to anybody who studies the brain is that frontal lobe. That's the biggest part of the brain, as you can see, and that's because we're doing things like complex reasoning, right? So, if I go back to the fist model, as you move back, you have this fissure in the middle of the brain that divides between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. That's involved with sensory information, visuospatial output. And then as you move to the back of the brain, there's a significant part of our brain devoted strictly to the visual system. And that's because as human beings, our vision is vital to our perception of the world. There's a lot of brain tissue devoted to vision. And then when we go back to the hand, so frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, what's the thumb doing there? That's the temporal lobe. And as you can see, it does kind of look like a boxing glove from the side, right? And so where the thumb of that boxing glove is, that's the temporal lobe. And deep within that structure, or that whole part of the brain, is something called the hippocampus, which is extremely relevant to anybody studying memory. And so it's not visible from the outside of the brain, but we're going to take a little look at it later. But the reason that's relevant is that is a crucial structure to the formation of memory. And it's basically the highest horsepower center of the brain. You have two hippocampi on either side of your brain. And so It's all you need to know about it is essentially it's vital to the formation of memory. Without the hippocampus, we don't have memory. How do we know that? We're going to talk about a little famous case known as patient HM. But before we move on to this, I also want to mention, so another important concept to understand is on the outside of the brain, on the surface of the brain is our gray matter, and the inside is white matter. White matter is connecting the different areas of the brain. It's how the brain talks to each other. And as you saw in that previous image, it's a little busy. You see all these arrows pointing back and forth. That's the white matter sending information between areas of gray matter to talk to each other. And this example, which is just simple memory formation, you can see how much of the brain is involved in memory formation, right? And this is why when we say, where does memory live? The oversimplification is the hippocampus, because the hippocampus is what is coordinating all this back and forth movement. However, you can have disruption to memory systems by breaking one of these loops or doing a number of things. So we're going to talk briefly about some conditions that are affected by disruption of this system. But how do we know this? There's a famous case known as patient HM. This is a 27-year-old male who was undergoing a lot of seizures to the point where they were debilitating. And so an extreme decision was made to remove the part of the brain that was identified as being responsible for those seizures. And as you can see here, where those black areas are, where the arrows are pointing, that is the hippocampus on both sides of the brain. So in patient HM, they completely removed the hippocampus on both sides of his brain. The good news is seizures stopped. The surgery worked. He's no longer seizing. He's able to function in his day-to-day life. However, because those hippocampi were gone, he had a very unique pattern of memory loss, which sparked our understanding of the functional neuroanatomy of the brain as it comes to memory. So because of HM, we understand that there's two types of memory that are distinct in our brains. There's our declarative memory and our non-declarative memory, sometimes called explicit versus implicit memory. And so declarative memory is what we think of classically, right, as remembering facts, remembering events, and then implicit memory is our ability to remember how to perform skills, right, how conditioning works, things like that. And so for patient HM, he completely lost the ability to form declarative memory, meaning he had remembered everything more or less leading up to when his seizures started, almost up to where the surgery took place, but he's no longer able to form new memories. However, what's fascinating is he could still be taught skills. And so that's how we understood, okay, the hippocampus isn't everything, but it's a big part of it. So what was most interesting about HM is they would teach him these tasks, and he would have no memory that he'd ever seen the task before, but he would still get better at it, right? And so that's how we understood, okay, the hippocampus is vital, but memory is distributed throughout the brain in different ways. And it's very complex and confusing, and that's why we exist in my career. And so briefly, I'm going to do a review of clinical syndromes that are relevant to what neuropsychologists do before diving into the main topic, which is Alzheimer's disease. So as you can imagine, we're involved heavily in traumatic brain injuries. And this is just a visualization here of, it's an amalgamation of where the damage to the brain takes place in a traumatic injury. And this is kind of a strange thing to think about, but our brains are technically floating in our skulls right now. Everyone in here, your brain is floating in something called cerebrospinal fluid. And so what happens is anytime there's a jolt to the brain, it's banging against the walls. And usually in a concussion, which is called a mild traumatic brain injury, you have a little bit of a bruise that after about 6 months is fully healed. You go back to normal. Now that can get complex if there's other things going on, but in moderate to severe traumatic brain injuries, it's not just a bruise, it's usually something beyond that, meaning there's damage to the tissue of the brain. And so the reason this visualization is here is it shows you the part of the brain that's most affected by traumatic brain injuries, as you can see up front. And why that is your brain's floating, but there's this shelf in your skull for our eyeballs, right? And so that's kind of a sharp shelf, so when the brain gets jostled in there, unfortunately, that's where a lot of the damage takes place, this more interior or frontal part of the brain. And so, as you can imagine, we saw that complex system of how different parts of the brain need to talk to each other. When there's a lot of damage up front, it can affect memory, even though the memory centers themselves may not have been touched by the injury. Other relevant clinical syndromes to what we do are strokes and anoxic brain injuries. Strokes can be bleeds or blockages in the brain, so there can be blood on the surface of the brain, within the brain, or there's a blockage where blood flow and oxygen are getting to a portion of the brain that results in damage to the brain. Anoxic brain injury is something that occurs in cardiac arrest where there's zero oxygen getting to the brain. And so what that does is that unfortunately preferentially affects the hippocampus first, because again, that's the highest powered center of the brain. And so above and beyond the most profound memory loss I've seen clinically is an anoxic brain injury. Because what happens is, you resuscitate the person, that's great, but there's usually substantial damage to both sides of the hippocampus. And it's just really unfortunate to see that, but that can be very profound. And then like HM, seizure disorders, these are particularly relevant to neuropsychologists, especially in children, because what's happening in the brain, if somebody starts having seizures at a young age, the brain is still growing, right? It's still connecting. So the brain will on its own start to put different functions into different parts of the brain, right? If you take an adult brain and you damage it, we can pretty accurately guess what's going to be affected because we know what parts of the brain do what. In children who have epilepsy, their brains wire differently because the brain, as it's developing, go, oh, something's not working over here. Let's put this skill or ability over here, right? And so our evaluations then become crucial if they do decide to do surgery like they did with HM. And so if you ever talk to a neuropsychologist who specializes in epilepsy or epilepsy evaluations, ask them for case examples. They are fascinating, and I think it's one of the coolest things that neuropsychologists do. I did this briefly for about a year. Got out of it because I wanted to work with adults, but very, very fascinating work. And then lastly, the thing we're going to focus on moving forward is Alzheimer's disease. So what is Alzheimer's disease? It is a neurodegenerative process that preferentially affects the bilateral hippocampus. This is why Alzheimer's disease is classically characterized by memory loss, although as the disease progresses, you have whole brain atrophy, meaning that multiple systems then begin to get impacted. And later in the disease process, basically the entire brain is affected. But it usually starts with, and not always, but usually starts with memory loss. Okay. And the reason, this is the vast majority of my work and the vast majority of neuropsychologists' work, is how common this is. And we're going to talk about just how common it is in a second. So, all that doom and gloom, let's move on to the main focus today. What can I do to have a healthier brain, right? And so, a little bit about why we know these things and why this is relevant is our understanding of blue zones. Has anybody heard of this before? Familiar with it? Okay. So the concept of a blue zone is a place where a statistically significant number of people live to be over 100 years old. The term for that is centenarian. So when we think of the general demographics of the US, each of these 5 blue zones, they have about a 10 times higher likelihood of having centenarians than the rest of the US. So very significant. Clearly something's going on in these regions that is very, very important and relevant to us if we want to understand healthy aging, right? And so specifically where these 5 places are Nicoya in Costa Rica, Sardinia in Italy, Ikaria, which is a small island in Greece, Okinawa in Japan, and the outlier Loma Linda, California, which is where I got my doctorate. So hence, we're going to be talking a little bit about that. And so researchers have found that the lifestyles of all these blue zones share very specific characteristics, and we're going to talk about what those are. And while diet is not the only thing they share, that's what we're going to focus on today because, again, if I had 8 hours to present to you, we talk about everything. We're going to focus on diet because I think that's the most salient. So all these places integrate exercise into their lifestyles. They have a strong sense of purpose. They focus a lot on stress management in different ways, but they all do. And they have a strong sense of community and family. And lastly, they all share some very curious, when it comes to research, dietary habits. And hence, this is the basis of my research. Plants are the cornerstones of all centenarian diets. Now, I'll pause here and say, am I a vegan? No. Have I already had some brisket in my short time here? Absolutely. But we're going to talk about the benefits of plant-based diets, okay? And I'll always pause here because this is almost always the first question I get about this. Well, what about alcohol? One of these blue zones has 0 alcohol, the rest to drink a little. So not my area of expertise, take it with a grain of salt. I'll touch on it briefly, but that's usually what people want to talk about. And I'll just say, of these, only one doesn't drink. So, interpret that how you will. I include pictures here because even though I don't mention it, you're going to notice all these blue zones except one are very beautiful. Does that have something to do with it? I would wager probably, although there is one exception to the beauty of nature in these places. So Sardinia, this is in Italy. This is a shepherd community. On average, everybody's walking at least 5 miles a day. So of course, exercise is a big cornerstone of their way of life. Their diets consist primarily of whole grains, beans, a little bit of wine, and I'll mention that Sardinian wine is pretty unique to the wine we typically have here. It's extremely rich in a very important compound, which we're going to talk about, and they are primarily gardening and producing their own fruits and vegetables that are the biggest portion of their diet. Okinawa, Japan is a fishing community, and I think the misnomer is people think, they must eat mostly rice and fish. They're catching the fish. However, the cornerstone of the Okinawan diet is actually the Japanese sweet potato. So that's what differentiates them from the rest of the island. And even though Japan is a statistical outlier in a lot of longevity specifics, Okinawa stands head and shoulders above the rest of Japan. And a lot of people think it's due to this sweet potato they're eating primarily. They do still eat rice and they do still drink some sake, but they're eating a lot of sweet potatoes. What's interesting about Okinawa, too, is Okinawa has a very strong sense of community. Very early on in life, you enter into these tight social groups that kind of act as a second family. And so if you run into financial or emotional trouble, these people pick you up. And so, as you know, as we age, when you lose a spouse or lose a partner or your children move away, oftentimes in some cultures that leads to isolation. This way of life in Okinawa doesn't exist because they have these tight communities that even if family members move away, pass away, you have a second family to back you up. So these people are very strongly supported socially. Nicoya, Costa Rica, another beautiful place. What's interesting about Nicoyans is they find a lot of joy and meaning in performing what we would think of as menial activities, keeping up your home, managing your day-to-day life. They get a lot of sense of meaning and purpose from that. They have these large multi-generational households, meaning you have grandparents living with grandchildren, so there's a ton of support, and the neighbors have extremely close and positive relationships with one another. Their diets consist primarily of black beans. I bolded that because that's probably the best news you can hear is black beans are available everywhere. They're dirt cheap and they're very good for you and very easy to incorporate into other things. They also eat lots of bananas, plantains, papayas, squash, and yams. So some good food there, and that's the backbone of their diet. Icaria is probably the most relevant when you talk to folks in this field because this is the best example of the benefits of the Mediterranean diet. Of all the blue zones, Icarians have the lowest rate of dementia rates by far. And their diet is that classical Mediterranean diet. And that's why that's garnered so much interest in aging and longevity research. This is the best example of the pure Mediterranean diet. And lo and behold, they have by far the lowest rates of dementia. So lots of fruits and vegetables, whole grain, beans, olive oil, and yes, they do have a little bit of wine and still lead the lowest dementia rates. Again, not my area of expertise, but take that what you will. And then the most interesting one to me, no personal bias of course, is Loma Linda, California. So this is a community of Seventh-day Adventists. I'm not an Adventist and I can't answer questions about the Adventist faith other than what I picked up on just being around a lot of them. But they are Christians who believe in a strict 24-hour Sabbath every Saturday. And so they're, of course, emphasizing rest and fellowship and spending time with friends and loved ones across the board. They have a strong emphasis on working in healthcare, which I think is fascinating to think about because these are folks who are Christians who also devote their life to helping people day in and day out. And they typically work well into their 90s, meaning they'll work until they basically have to retire. And so they're spending every waking moment not only living in their faith, but acting on that faith in a way where they're helping people. They're doctors, dentists, nurses. It's fascinating. The vast majority of Adventists you'll find work in healthcare. And I think there's probably something to that, right? Their helping doesn't just extend to one day of the week. It's every waking moment, essentially, as they're engaged in helping other people. It's fascinating. And the one thing that makes them probably the most unique is Seventh-day Adventists are vegans for the most part. They also have zero alcohol, zero nicotine, and many have zero caffeine as well, although I am going to talk about some of the benefits of caffeine at the end from a specific plant compound. But Loma Linda to me is unique of all the blue zones because Loma Linda, California sits right next to the highest crime city in California. It's polluted. That is probably the best scenery I could find of Loma Linda, California. And so clearly what this tells me is the sense of community matters, exercise and working in a meaningful field matters, and of course diet really does matter, right? The backbone of their diet is plants. So we're going to talk about what those are. So phytochemicals is a fancy word to say these are compounds produced by plants, so fruits and vegetables. And what these do in nature is they result in bright colors, odors, irritants, basically there to prevent enable the plant's survival, right? So it's protecting against external threats, predation, as well as internal threats. So these phytochemicals are important. They're what makes plants nutritious, right? And so consuming plants that have phytochemicals in them pose a number of health benefits to human beings. How does that work? The answer is it works synergistically across many different pathways. So reduces inflammation, lowers the risk of what's called apoptosis, which is neuronal cell death, basically your neurons dying. It promotes neurogenesis, which is neuronal cell growth that happens in things like learning and memory. Improves neurotransmission, which is chemically how the brain speaks to other parts of the brain, and it increases enzymatic function, meaning that your cells are operating better. So these pathways, of course, have a direct impact on multiple aspects of age-related neuropathology. And so, going back to Alzheimer's disease, again, we talked about that structure called the hippocampus that's within the temporal lobe. Plaque accumulation has been identified here, and that's a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. So that's typically the part of the brain that most classically is affected in Alzheimer's. So the presence of plaques are noted significantly earlier than the onset of clinical symptoms. I'm going to visualize this on the next slide. And so takeaway from this is, again, we could talk about this for days on end, but these structures are implicated in learning and memory, and it's why Alzheimer's disease is characterized by memory deficits. So again, that explains the cognitive impairments you typically see. So I'm going to hopefully get this to work, but so what this is going to visualize and what this hopefully will illustrate is, so again, plaque buildup is a hallmark of this disease, right? And so the answer is, well, shouldn't this be easy to treat, right? You give something that reduces the plaque formation, you get rid of Alzheimer's. First of all, it's not just the plaque formation, and this, I think, is going to illustrate the main reason we haven't had a good hit on pharmacological interventions for Alzheimer's disease. So this is a very unique study where there are certain individuals who carry a strong genetic predisposition to get early onset Alzheimer's disease. We know what gene this is, so we're able to identify these folks. And so these willing participants said, let's study your brains before the disease shows up because we're anticipating it is going to show up because you have a strong family history of it. And so what this is going to illustrate is the colors here as they go up the gradient from purple to red, that's showing an increase in this particular plaque in the brain. And the most important thing here is that number at the bottom. So we're going to start at 25 years before a clinical diagnosis is made. Okay, so you're going to see just how much plaques are building up before the symptoms of the disease start to show up. Okay. So these are plaques building up in the brain. We're still 15 years before the onset of the disease, right? And so throughout the brain, and in particular regions of the brain, you're seeing more, but overall, there's a lot of plaque burden taking place. So this is still 5 years before the clinical symptoms show up. That's where the diagnosis is made, right there. And then it stops there because, unfortunately, that's around the mean survival time post-clinical diagnosis. So why is this so hard to treat? Because the disease cascade starts years before we pick up on it clinically. And the only reason we have data like this is we identified which genes are responsible so we could take a look at these folks. But this is why it's so hard to treat. This is why we don't have a miracle cure and why we may never have one, is the cascade starts so long before we can pick up on this clinically. So imagine if we didn't start treating cancers until stage 4. Very difficult to do much about that, right? Unfortunately, that's what we're up against with Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so how many folks are affected by this? Last time I did this presentation a year ago, that said 5 million at the top. Now we're over 6 million. And again, that's an effect of an aging population, right? As we mentioned at the top, we're getting better at treating other forms of all-cause mortality. We don't have anything for this. That number is going to continue to grow. So over 6 million Americans currently have Alzheimer's disease, and that's a big number. It's characterized by the presentation of memory, motor, language, and executive functioning deficits that result in functional impairments. And why we mention functional impairments, that's how we make the clinical diagnosis, right? As soon as you notice something has changed with your relative or loved one, that's when we get the doctors involved, that's when the diagnosis is made. So the neuropathological markers, for years, we were stymied because that last slide where I showed the plaque formation, we thought, aha, that's the disease. If we get that, we're good to go, right? The problem is that's just a part of the disease. You have plaque formation, you have neurons that tangle, you have dysfunction of the mitochondria within the cells, you have inflammation of the whole brain, you have abnormal cell growth that can be problematic. You have death of neurons, and unfortunately the one that we're finding now is you have what's called the blood-brain barrier, which is an oversimplification is it's what allows things into your brain that should go into your brain and gets things out of the brain that you don't want in your brain. In Alzheimer's disease, that's disrupted heavily. So more things are getting in there that shouldn't get in there, and more things that should be coming out of there aren't coming out of there as efficiently as we thought. It's also related to things like you're more susceptible to bacterial and viral infections of the brain. And the one thing that I think is most fascinating is we see disruption of the gut microbiome in Alzheimer's disease. And what the gut microbiome is you have this incredibly rich bacterial system in your gut that talks bidirectionally with your brain. And we think that's a big reason why diet and Alzheimer's disease are so intrinsically related. That system is incredibly complex. And again, that's beyond the scope of this presentation, other than if that sounds fascinating, it is. So another thing I mention here, and just because when I talk about this, there's a significant overlap here, so I might as well mention it. Even if you have one of the lucky genes that protects you from Alzheimer's disease, over almost approaching 8 million Americans have had a stroke. And vascular cognitive impairment is right behind Alzheimer's disease in terms of the cause of dementia, right? And so basically what vascular cognitive impairment is, it's a catch-all term for any type of cognitive impairment due to cerebrovascular disease, strokes, what have you. Again, right behind Alzheimer's disease. I don't focus on this, but when I'm talking about what helps prevent and stave off Alzheimer's disease, I'm also talking about what staves off vascular disease in the brain. So even though that's not the focus, just understand you're getting a good bang for your buck today. It's going to help with that. It's going to help with this. This one's just a little more salient because this one especially, sometimes Alzheimer's disease is more genetic. Vascular disease is almost always more lifestyle. So smoking, substance abuse, being sedentary, poor diets, those are going to increase your risk for all these things. So these look a little different clinically depending on the part of the brain that's affected, but just know, and you may have the question, can you have both of these at the same time? Unfortunately, yes. And that's what makes our job difficult sometimes, is trying to tease apart etiologically. Is it something progressive? Is it something more static? Is it a little bit of both? The answer is a lot of times it is a little bit of both. So back to the focus, phytochemicals and dementia. So several different phytochemicals affect several aspects of age-related neuropathology. Their mechanisms are vast, include things like antioxidant effects, anti-inflammatory effects, inflammation in the brain. They help the brain speak and communicate and heal itself in many ways. And again, the gut microbiome is highly implicated in how available these plant chemicals are to your brain. And what's fascinating is, and I should have mentioned at the top, so anytime someone's giving a presentation on brain health, the first question you should ask is, what are they selling? I did not include a disclosure slide for a reason. I work for a large healthcare provider. I don't recommend supplements. I don't talk about supplements, and I'm certainly not selling a supplement. But anytime you hear anybody talk about the brain and brain health and thinking and how to improve it, first question should be, are they selling something? Because the answer is, when you take things from supplements versus whole plant products, what we understand now is the whole plant product is better than the supplement, and the reason is the gut microbiome in the digestion of the plant product makes these helpful chemicals more bioavailable than if you were to try to take it by itself. So again, that's why when they say, well, can I just supplement all these things you're about to talk about? Sure, you can. Is it going to help? Probably. Is it better to get it from the plant source that it's derived from? Absolutely. And why that is? The gut microbiome. So we're briefly, before we dive in, we're just going to do a quick overview of the experimental evidence of why these things are helpful. But epidemiological means when we look at populations, how do we have evidence of this? So when we look at populations that regularly consume lots of fruits and vegetables, of course, they have lower risks of dementia. And when they do have dementia, it progresses a little slower. So when we look at folks who consume lots of fruits and vegetables in early life, they have a decreased risk of dementia in later life. And so older adults who consume more fruits and vegetables than their peers have a significantly better cognitive outcomes across the board. And evidence that acquiring, again, vitamin sources through your diet versus supplementation seems to be crucial, right? When we look at folks who have a lifetime of consuming lots of vitamin B, this is actually going to account for about a 50% reduction when we look at the folks at the other end of the spectrum. So just to put a fancy number to it. So when we look at folks, okay, these are our highest consumers of vitamin B dietary. These are our lowest consumer of dietary vitamin B. There's about a 50% difference in their dementia rates. So that's substantial. That's clinically significant. And I think that's what sparked a lot of the interest in this type of research. Other things we already know about due to the Mediterranean diet, dietary omega-3 fatty acids. These are what you get in flax seeds, all kinds of nuts, algae, which is not something that a lot of folks are consuming, but again, nuts are a little more common in certain fish. These protect specifically against different aspects of dementia-related processes. So when we look at diets that have lots of olive oil, lots of nuts, these folks tend to have improved cognitive function in older age. There are also other sources of bioactive phytochemicals, which we're going to dive into now. These are the colorful, flavorful, aromatic spices. These things are nature's way of telling us this contains lots of helpful stuff. And so older adults whose lifetime diets include, in my favorite example, curry, this bright powder that you're probably familiar with, and we'll look at the plant that it comes from, these folks typically do better on cognitive tests as they age. So on to the experimental evidence. So this is going to get a little jargony, and there's going to be some big words on the slides, so apologies for that. I just want to try to present the research as it exists, and so I don't want to reword things, but I'm going to do my best to kind of translate as we go through. But just, again, the takeaway here is various aspects of dementia neuropathology can be manipulated by plants and the chemicals contained within plants, and there's a whole breadth of experimental literature that demonstrates that there's multiple ways in which these plants offer benefits to our brains. So we're going to focus first on the polyphenols. Many plants produce polyphenols. Turmeric or curcumin, pomegranates contain multiple phenolic acids. We'll talk a little bit about the stilbenoids. Resveratrol is that one that's in things like grapes, so that's the one that was brought up often with wine. Unfortunately, a lot of wine has much lower resveratrol than we initially thought, with the exception of that very expensive, fancy Sardinian wine. And then we'll touch briefly on the flavonoids as well. These are things found in fruits, vegetables, but we're going to go through these individually. So, starting with curcumin, this is what's found in the curry spice. This is that bright yellow root that you've probably seen at the grocery store. Has anybody ever cooked with this? Because be careful, it will stain your hands, it will stain your clothes, it will be there and it's not going away. That said, if you buy the curry powder, that's a little more manageable. So dietary curcumin prevents oxidative stress, less damage to your brain. You see, and when we look at rodent models of this, these rats who are given a lot of curcumin tend to do better on cognitive measures related to this. And won't get into this heavily, but we use transgenic rodent models a lot when studying Alzheimer's disease. And unfortunately, this was in the media a lot for all the wrong reasons. I think there was a confusion between what a transgenic rodent is, and it got mixed up with a transgender rodent recently. Not related, not connected. So a transgenic rodent is a rodent that's born with the biological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. And so it's extremely useful for researchers because we can use that model to say this rat's brain is going to take the pathway that a human brain would in terms of the plaque formulation, the cell death, those sorts of things. So nothing to do with gender. And unfortunately, yeah, I've had to answer lots of questions about that lately. But when we, again, back to curcumin. So these transgenic mice who have curcumin-rich diets, not only are they having all these different biomarker reductions, in experimental models of traumatic brain injury, meaning where you do a sham brain injury to these rodents, the rodents who had a lot of curcumin in their diet actually recovered a little better, which is fascinating to think about because you think about that's a direct injury to the brain, and clearly it's promoting recovery and health within the brain if that's evidenced, right? And so curcumin leads to a number of different aspects of age-related benefits. So also happens to be a potent microbial factor, which means that there's probably multiple reasons curcumin is beneficial to your brain. So you see less plaque formation, it destabilizes already formed plaques. The specific mechanism's a little unclear, but it's probably due to a synergistic effect of both its anti-aging and its antimicrobial properties. So curcumin, great thing to have in your diet. Cheap, easy, affordable, easy to work in there. This one I should have put an asterisk next to. There's a big asterisk that come with pomegranates. Pomegranates are great. They're relatively affordable. I believe they grow in this climate, so that's all awesome. Their juices and extracts demonstrate significant bioactive properties via antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects. They do a number of things to produce a healthy brain, things like reduced biomarkers of inflammation, other things like that. When we look at different experiments, we found that, this was a fascinating study that was done by our lab. Pomegranate supplemented pregnant mice actually had protection of neonatal insults to their offspring who were given a lot of pomegranate juice. And 6 months of consumption actually showed reduced plaque formation in the hippocampus, that memory structure, and it improved their performance on cognitive measures. So brought down the plaques, led to improved behavioral outcomes. And juice supplementation tends to improve learning and memory and reduces plaque deposition, shows a significant improvement in behavioral outcomes as well. Again, it's difficult to talk about this without acknowledging the elephant in the room, which is that pomegranates do have a lot of sugar. So the answer isn't go home, buy up a ton of pomegranate juice and start drinking it by the gallon. There's a balancing act there, right? So a little bit goes a long way. Be very cautious with your sugar intakes. Talk to your doctor about it, okay? But again, takeaway from this is the whole fruit is probably better than an extract. If you can eat it from the plant source, that's probably better than the juice, and also that helps you regulate the sugar content. The gut microbiome specifically with these compounds is vital because, again, if you try to take just that isolated supplement of what's in here that we think is helpful, it's less effective than getting it from the whole plant product. That's because your gut microbiome is turning it into something that's a little more bioavailable in your brain. And so also, again, this one's highly implicated in cerebrovascular health. So again, that's why I kind of touched on helps with Alzheimer's, helps with vascular disease. That's pretty much the case for everything we're talking about in pomegranate specifically. On to resveratrol. This is the one everybody likes to talk about because of the growing popularity of wine, although I think it's going down, but still. I like to think of it more as something that's found in nuts and grapes rather than wine because most wine doesn't have very much of it. So what we know is this induces plaque clearance. So those plaques we saw forming in the brain, this helps clear those out, get those out of the brain, and modulates several other dementia-related pathways in the brain. These folks have reduced cerebrovascular disease. And again, we're talking about folks who have small to moderate amounts of wine tend to see some improved biomarkers. This is probably why. And an interesting study where we treated transgenic mice with resveratrol after traumatic brain injury, reduced the damage to the brain slightly. What that means is, if you get a brain injury, don't start downing a bunch of wine. That's going to have the opposite effect. But if you have a diet that's rich in resveratrol, you have protection from insults to the brain. The flavins, these are things found in high concentration in tea leaves. And when we look at places that drink a lot of tea, this can get complicated. Most people who take tea are having tea with a lot of sugar, a lot of cream. So again, difficult to look at the epidemiological data and get much out of it because that population-based data says, well, they may drink a lot of tea, but what else are they consuming? So again, what we do know is that there's experimental evidence that the tea leaf and the compounds within the tea leaf are beneficial and protect against various dementia-related pathways. Specifically, there's this compound called EGCG, which was really interesting to a lot of people because this was shown experimentally in rodents to reduce behavioral impairments in experimental models, reduce plaque production in those transgenic mice. However, what we found, again, and this is going to be a carryover across all these compounds, by itself, it's less effective than when you get it from the whole plant product. So it does help, but the tea leaf has multiple things, not just one compound that's beneficial. So again, this is why if somebody's selling you a supplement, ask where the supplement comes from, trace it back to the plant source. That's probably what you want to just be consuming more of rather than trying to bypass that. The anthocyanidins, long word, just basically saying this is that bright pigmented color you see in things like blueberries. Again, blueberry-rich diets are great, again, as long as you're monitoring your sugars responsibly. Transgenic mice who have a lot of blueberries tend to do better on learning and memory measures. They show decreased biomarkers of dementia and other forces of age-related neuropathology in the brain. And so again, blueberries are a good one, relatively affordable, and easy to implement into your diet as long as you're being responsible about your sugar levels. Specifically, let's focus on luteolin. So luteolin is found in celery, broccoli, a lot of those cruciferous vegetables, and this acts on multiple pathways associated with the development of dementia. So again, we focused a lot on fruits. Now we're getting on to the vegetables. And so in rodent models, this protects against cognitive impairment, reduces several biomarkers related to age-related neurodegeneration, reduces inflammation, prevents plaque formation, and helps with mitochondrial function within the cells themselves. It also helps protect against the permeability of that blood-brain barrier, which we talked about earlier. So I focus on this one because this one is, not caveated with, oh no, this has lots of sugar. Nope, lots of luteolin's good for you, okay? Back to sugar. Ficitin, this is found in strawberry and raspberries. Very good for you, again, as long as you're being responsible at the sugar levels. These specifically are related to something called the Krebs process. This is its oversimplification is this is important to learning and memory. So when we're forming memories, your neurons are firing together, they're wiring together. Diets rich in this, we see a direct enhancement of that process. Another favorite of mine, because this doesn't have to come with the caveat of sugar, is the organosulfurs. You get this in garlic. This is that sulfur-containing phytochemical that gives garlic its potent aroma. Adding garlic extracts to the diets of transgenic mice actually ameliorated cognitive deficits, reduced plaque formation, and reduced markers of oxidative stress within the brain. And garlic and its compounds act in multiple different pathways to help with age-related neuropathology. And of course, garlic is a cornerstone of many cuisines across the world. So this is what opens up okay, how do I eat more of this stuff? How do I do healthier? Regardless of your heritage, there's probably something that you eat growing up that has a lot of garlic in it. Do more of that. Omega-3 fatty acids, these got a lot of hype because there was hope that just taking these supplements was going to be this big game changer. Turns out, not so much. However, eating diets that have lots of these, that's the cornerstone of why the Mediterranean diet's so effective. So you can supplement these, talk to your doctor about that. I will say what the research shows is diets that are rich in where these things come from are going to be your best bet than just trying to supplement things like DHA. So again, these are found mainly in flax, nuts, certain fish. Consuming these, we have less biomarkers of inflammation, improves learning and memory, increases gray matter volume, alters your gut microbiota composition, which is vital to getting other helpful phytochemicals into the brain in statistically significant concentrations. So diets rich in omega-3 fatty acids, more or less across the board, these are supported by the data. Phytovitamins, this is just a fancy way of saying bioavailable vitamins. Vitamin E's, vitamin B's, found in many, many plants. And so you see a whole mess of plants I included here. All of these are rich in vitamin E and vitamin B. Specifically, supplementing these has shown some interesting data. However, it's better to consume these over long periods of time. But that being said, if you haven't been eating it, that doesn't mean you shouldn't, because when you do this, we've shown in rodent models that introducing these to the diets of these animals does reduce some of the learning and behavioral deficits seen in that model of Alzheimer's disease. So dietary folic acid, again, results in specific actions on the hippocampus, right? And the hippocampus is this sensitive structure in your brain related to memory. So if your diet's rich in vitamin B, that's good for your memory, okay? And so high dose that was given to healthy adults over a 4-week period actually increased some of their functional abilities, not in a really game-changing way, but still something's better than nothing in this population. And so one of the problems with this is that high dose wasn't necessarily effective in folks with more moderate dementia. So again, vitamin D is a preventative measure, not so much. Consuming lots of it throughout your life, protective. That's the way to look at this. And so long-term consumption of this is actually associated with increased gray matter volume. That's that surface part of the brain. So folks who consume lots of vitamin B have more gray matter volume as they age. This is a fun one, caffeine. So caffeine, is it good for you? Is it bad for you? This is probably the most heavily caveated of these because how we consume caffeine varies quite a bit, right? Lots of sugar, lots of cream, probably going to counteract the antioxidant benefit from caffeine. Also, there is a difference between crude caffeine and plant-based caffeine when it comes to the benefits. So if you like your energy drinks, your 5-hour energies, maybe you take caffeine pills, you're going to lose a lot of the benefit, right? And so when we compared animals given caffeine that was derived from plants versus pure caffeine, you see the antioxidant activity is a big reason this is a health benefit. So again, getting it from the plant source is going to be your best bet rather than just starting to take caffeine pills. Less beneficial. So that was a crash course through various aspects of these things that are helpful to you. The takeaway here is age-related neuropathology and the behavioral deficits associated with it are due to a gradual accumulation of plaques within your brain. This causes oxidative stress, increases inflammation in the brain, leads to further problems downwind, things like plaque deposition, neuronal degradation, other downstream effects. And then also throughout our life, keep in mind, we're picking up a variety of low-grade insults, right? Maybe minor head injuries, minor vascular events in the brain that are subclinical. All these things, if you're living your life, are going to add up and contribute to your risk factors there. However, the good news is if you're eating the diets rich in these compounds we talked about, you're not just preventing the risk from Alzheimer's disease, you're also preventing the risk from all those other types of disease, right? So overall, even if you don't carry a family risk of Alzheimer's disease, good idea to still pay attention to this stuff because it's helping prevent cerebrovascular disease as well. So the takeaway is supplementation, isolation, targeting this after the symptoms show up, going to be less helpful. A lifetime of consuming diets rich in this stuff, that is going to be helpful. And in the absence of pharmacological treatments, this is probably our best bet, right? Unfortunately, we don't have a miracle cure and we're probably not looking at one anytime soon. So the best thing you can do is eat well, exercise, and when I say eat well, that is eat a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, plant-based compounds, right? Talk to your doctor about this. Dietitians and nutritionists are well aware of this research, usually part of your insurance coverage. If you haven't had a free consultation with one, you should look into it. If it's not covered by your insurance provider, ask them why it isn't, because this is clearly related to your healthy aging. Having these things in your diet and having these things be the cornerstone of your diet are going to help with your brain's health across multiple pathways, and I list them out here. Regulation of your gut microbiome, protection of your blood-brain barrier, modulation of how the brain talks to itself in different regions, anti-inflammation, antioxidant effects. You reduce the ability of your brain to unintentionally damage itself in response to events to the brain, stimulates the growth of new neurons, maintains the mitochondria function within your brain. It's a long list basically saying that this isn't just going to do one thing, it's going to do a number of things that are going to help your brain. So, a lifetime of consuming these neuroprotective phytochemicals provides significant protection for both environmental and age-related insults that accelerate the progression of dementia-related pathology. So diets consuming a wide variety of these bioactive phytochemicals from various plant sources offers a synergistic benefit over just trying to supplement these in isolation. So again, one thing you ask anytime someone talks about brain health, what are you selling? If the answer is nothing, allow them to continue. I'm going to skip through the sleep stuff just for the sake of time, although I will briefly say, I didn't necessarily mention it when talking about the blue zones. However, one of the things they all share is they're good sleepers. And sleep and Alzheimer's disease and other forms of all-cause mortality are being studied heavily, and we're learning more and more that sleep is vital to all of these things, right? And so when I say sleep, if you take away one thing from this, 7 hours is your mark. If you're chronically below 7 hours, talk to your doctor. There's statistically significant differences between folks who average less than 7 hours of sleep per night versus folks who average 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. And another big one, which is eating up a lot of my time, not my area of expertise, but something called obstructive sleep apnea, which folks may have heard of. Obstructive sleep apnea is when your brain is not getting enough oxygen. And what we know now is that preferentially affects the hippocampus specifically. So I have a lot of younger folks coming to me with pretty profound memory difficulties. And one of the first questions I ask now is, does your partner tell you that you snore? Does your partner tell you that you gasp in your sleep? The answer is yes. Talk to your doctor. This is one of the few reversible forms of memory loss, because if we treat that sleep apnea, your hippocampus gets more oxygen, it plumps back up, and it helps reduce a number of different further risk factors down the road. So not going to focus on that, other than happy to talk about that even though we didn't cover it in the presentation, just because I've been doing a lot of research on that lately. There's my personal email. I included a whole bunch of references and I'll distribute these slides. If you want to know more about neuropsychology itself, these are two great stopping points, especially that No Neuropsychology lecture series. It's free, available at different levels of knowledge and interest. Great link to get down if you don't have it. And of course, I'll open it up for questions here, but there is my personal email if you want to have a longer-winded conversation about any of this stuff.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent. I think I read recently that sleep is the cheapest health benefit that you can reward yourself with. So
100%.
Q&A. Really appreciate the opportunity to Q&A. So real quick, 2 rules for Q&A. First of all, I will have a microphone. Who else will have a microphone? David will also have a microphone. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay, we'll bring the microphone to you, and then we'll take turns asking questions. When you receive the microphone, please be sure to ask a question. Okay, sometimes people want to go on and on and on and on, telling us what they think about a topic. Please don't be that person. If you need to set up your question with a little bit of commentary, that's fine. Please keep it to a minimum and be sure to ask a question. Second rule is I'm the president. I get to ask the first question. Okay, so earlier I mentioned my mother had Alzheimer's, and that her mother really had severe Alzheimer's. So as we age, it's normal to deal with memory loss and cognitive decline.
Correct.
As you say. Yeah. Okay, and that's different from actually having Alzheimer's. It doesn't mean that you have it or that you're going to have it.
Correct.
From a self-diagnosis point of view, because my mother was tortured with every time she forgot something. She couldn't remember somebody's name. She thought, oh, here it is. I've got Alzheimer's now. Okay. So from a self-diagnosis, when should someone really start to get checked out for if they have it?
Functional impairment, meaning that things that used to be easy for you start to become challenging, right? So one of the first markers we typically see clinically is if somebody is no longer able to manage their finances without difficulty. That's usually an early sign because, as everybody here, I mean, it's tax season, right? Managing your finances is difficult, right? It creates a number of challenges. You have to divide your attention. You have to be aware of any errors you're making. Usually the first sign is family members notice, they're missing bills, which is out of character. Anything that appears in contrast to what somebody's baseline was, good idea to touch base with a doctor. And a big caveat to that is if there's a huge change in somebody's life, meaning a big stressor, depression, grief, that's going to result in memory loss. And that's regardless, even if you're a young adult, that's true. So in the absence of a significant life event like that, if something looks really out of character, talk to your doctor. The good news about these evaluations, very low risk. No needles, no machines. We can take a look in a non-invasive way. Never hurts to ask your doctor about it. What they'll typically do is a very brief screening that takes just a couple of minutes. That's done by a physician. If that's normal, you're probably fine. If that's abnormal, you do the longer evaluation with one of us. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay.
A ridiculous number of footnotes on your slides. Is this based on a research paper or your thesis?
Portions of it, yes, although I've been building up on it over the years. So I will do my best to distribute the slides, which I have, let's get a final number here. Something like 350 citations for you to busy yourself with if you want to do that. And growing. Every time I do this, there's another 20 added. So there's so much research on this. Fortunately, because it's fruits and vegetables, getting a pharmaceutical agent approved to go through the testing process, very difficult. When it comes to researching things like fruits and vegetables, IRBs go, great, let's approve that research. Nobody's going to pass away on us. We're not going to have to monitor toxicity. So lots of publications, lots of new publications, and they're fairly cheap to do. So hence the giant list that's ever growing. Yeah.
I recently saw a study linking antidepressants, namely escitalopram, to Alzheimer's. Have you read that?
Well, the challenge with that specifically is we know depression is linked to Alzheimer's. And so it's difficult to say whether specific antidepressants, and I know there's been some conflict in the research among this, is it driven by the specific medications, or is it the fact that these are depressed folks who are in an increased risk category, right? So I'll say that is difficult to tease apart because long-term depression is a significant risk factor for dementia. So that's difficult to study experimentally. From what I understood, especially with some of these specific agents, I believe that's an SSRI. SSRIs typically are viewed as not significant contributors to cognitive decline. However, benzodiazepines, that's another conversation. If folks are taking benzodiazepines as you reach age 50, 60, talk to your doctor about that. You're probably going to want to be on something longer acting. SSRIs, they're difficult. Yeah, so sorry for the bad answer there.
I'm 71. Is it too late to change my diet since the damage's already been done?
No. The takeaway from that is even in folks where we introduced healthier diets after the disease showed up, there's still benefit. Is it going to reverse it? Is it going to stop it? Unfortunately, no. So the answer is it's never too late to improve your diet. However, the best bet is to eat healthy throughout your life, of course, and that's where we see significant shifts in the development of it. So the answer is yes, you can change your diet, you'll see benefit from it. Yeah.
Dr. Ross, this is a question more about not so much memory loss, but memory retention.
Sure.
There are times, maybe y'all can experience this too, I'll see something that will trigger an event that occurred in my life 10, 15 years ago, maybe a camping trip. It's something I haven't thought about in 10 years, but yet in a quiet moment I can recreate that trip. I can remember the headquarters building at the camp. I can think of where the tent was set. The point is, things that were buried in my brain still resurface. And I'm curious about the brain as a computer. It's not zeros and ones.
Right.
It's what in the world is it? Is it
right?
Simple answer, right?
No, it's a fascinating thing. So I'll try my best to not go on a tangent here. There's something called the reminiscence bump, which is our memory for events between the ages of 15 and 25 are the best of our life, right? So meaning no matter how old you are, you're going to have very specific memories of that part of your life. Why that occurs from a anecdotal perspective, those are the best years of your life, right? And so you're able to recall those memories. And what's interesting about what you're talking about is, so the hippocampus is this structure that forms memories. However, a crucial component to that is the sensations involved in forming those memories are related to where it's stored in your brain. Meaning visual memory, your hippocampus is talking to the visual part of your brain. Other types of sense memory. So that's why in those moments, you may not even be conscious of what triggered that memory, but it's probably something related to a sense you experienced, a sight, a smell, a sound, that all of a sudden you're right there, right? That's the way memory storage works. It also explains deja vu. Deja vu is a phenomenon where your brain gets confused and it's like, gosh, I think I've experienced this before. It's a hiccup in that system. So it's not some profound event, unfortunately, but yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
Of course.
Appreciate it a lot, and the background about your profession and what you do.
Yeah.
So the takeaway seems to be eat a diet rich in fruits and vegetables.
Correct.
There seems to be a lot of variables with that. Like, could you talk about organic versus non-organic and the soil composition that plants are grown in, and maybe preparation, like cooking versus raw?
Great question. The challenge here is if the option is don't eat fruits and vegetables or eat organic fruits and vegetables, eat the fruits and vegetables. The better quality available to you, go with it, right? Now, if you're going to go into debt, going to organic versus non-organic, the point is there's not a huge difference we found in the research comparing these. But again, the higher quality, the freshness, all those things are things you need to factor in, right? And in terms of preparation, here comes the real bad news. Frying things clearly is the least healthy way to get these, right? You're losing a lot of the beneficial constituents in these, and you're adding in a bunch of free radicals, other things that don't want there. Even things that we thought of as healthy, like boiling broccoli. This is a specific study I think I included in there. Boiling broccoli, you're actually leaching a lot of the nutrients out into the water. right? And so if you're just boiling the broccoli and then eating the broccoli, you're missing a lot of the beneficial stuff. So in general, raw is your best bet. Steamed is good. But the more complex your preparation is, meaning if you're adding in lots of other things and just nuking that product, you're probably losing a lot of the benefit there. It's one of the reasons we see that things like juicing is less healthy than eating the fruits and vegetables of what you juiced, because that fiber that you're getting out when you're juicing is crucial to your gut microbiome getting that stuff to your brain. So again, the purer, the higher quality, the better. Is there huge statistical differences between organic versus non-organic or specific types of soil? The only really salient example I can think of was the example I gave about the Sardinian wine versus most wine. Those particular grapes, that particular wine production process has a huge number more of resveratrol. And just again, it's a quality thing, right? So the higher quality you have available to you within reason, go with that. But that doesn't mean don't eat fruits and vegetables if you can't get organic. Still eat what you can, right?
Thank you again for the excellent presentation. And you didn't actually address a few times.
A couple times, yeah. I surprised myself, yeah.
My question is, with that time lapse you showed, and the recognition that these issues happen in the brain earlier than if you wait to the point where you're having cognitive issues, it's too late to do a whole lot about it. Is there any plan or recommendation? Should people try to get screened earlier, especially if they have a family history? Anything like that? Because it seems like, people get checked proactively for cardiac, blockage and things like that. We get our brains checked too to see if we are at risk, so that we can get at this early.
Great question. This is going to get interesting in the next decade, specifically because we're very close to actually being able to test for this and catch it earlier, right? And if we can do that with a non-invasive blood test, we can get a head start on this in ways that previously we didn't think. Up until, relatively recently, we had to wait for it to show up clinically to do anything about it. That is going to change within our lifetime. We are going to have a test, and I probably said this 10 years ago and would have been proved a fool, but my hope is within the next couple of years, we will have a test that says, okay, there is something here that's present that's indicative of this, let's start doing something. What is interesting is we do know the genes that protect you from Alzheimer's and that are going to lead you to get Alzheimer's, very likely. So it gets into a weird ethical area that we don't have time for here, where you can technically find out if you have this gene, whether the neuroprotective one or the one that puts you at risk. Is it better to know that than not to know that? You should be doing these things anyways, and in the absence of a treatment, I don't know if it's that beneficial. That may change in the next couple of years. If we do have a really good targeted therapeutic, the obvious answer would be let's find out who's most at risk so we can get them in that line. As of right now, I talk to your doctor. Yeah.
Yes, I just have a question about hearing loss and dementia.
Yeah.
We all know that they're connected.
Yep.
But if you already suffer with significant hearing loss, do you have any comments as to, is there something proactive you can do besides having the hearing aids?
Absolutely. Yeah. And why that is a fascinating question. And I'll go back to my slides on the blue zones, right? What is one of the big factors that connects all those blue zones? Strong sense of community, strong sense of socialization. What do we see happens with folks who suffer from hearing loss? They withdraw, right? They stop socializing. They may be present socially, but they're not active in the conversation. They feel left out. We think that's a huge component of why there's such an intrinsic connection between hearing loss and dementia risk. So hearing aids are not ideal, but they get better every year, right? As somebody myself who has some hearing damage, I will tell you that it's something to be aware of, right? If you notice you're just not hearing conversations and you're pulling away because of your hearing loss, talk to an audiologist as soon as possible. And the main takeaway is, even if your hearing's great, if you're pulling away socially, you're going to put yourself right into that same risk category. Is there something neurological related to the two? That remains pretty elusive. It's probably most likely due to that social piece. So get ahead of it as best you can. The aids get better every year. They get smaller every year. They get more affordable, hopefully. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Ross, and thank you for teaching us and informing us how we can get more nutrients into our bodies. And I had a question, kind of a two-part question.
Sure.
The first give us your thoughts about the role that processed diet, carbs, and sugar, refined sugar, plays in damaging the, in playing a role in actually just overall in neurodegenerative diseases.
Yeah.
And the second part of that question is, does the vagus nerve leading from the gut to the brain have a pathway in opening up, and is that a big source of why we're seeing such an increase in all the many diseases across the country?
Great question. Unfortunately, I'm gonna pass on the vagus nerve question because that is a long answer. We would need another hour to go through that. The research is fascinating but complex, and there's a lot of debate, and to the point where folks specialize in looking at that only. That's all they do. I would defer one of those folks to answer that question. In regards to sugar, high sugar diets, high carb diets are incredibly inflammatory, right? So if you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables, but you're also eating, a pound of sugar on top of that, you're getting the benefit of those fruits and vegetables, but you're probably losing the battle to the inflammation that all that sugar is causing, right? And so it's one of the reasons we see, there are folks who do abide to a fruitarian diet, which is all fruit, right? And they have a lot of health issues because of the amount of sugar they're taking in, right? And granted, it's still fairly healthy in some aspects because they're getting lots of fiber, which is great, but that sugar causes a number of problems with, the gut, the body, the periphery, all sorts of things. So processed, again, it's a tough term because some processes are there for a reason, like pasteurization and things like that. But when it comes to sugar, that's the best thing to talk to your doctor about. That's probably the biggest issue with the Western diet, right? I had a dietitian friend tell me once that it's less to do with what you're eating and more to do with what you're not eating. I used to agree with that until I saw the average sugar intake of the American, and I was like, okay, maybe it is more to do with what we are eating, but it's tricky. You want to eat lots of fruits, you want to watch the sugar. Added sugars specifically are usually the easiest thing to target. But in terms of vagus nerve stimulation, fascinating research. That would be a whole other presentation, though. Yeah.
Two things that I didn't hear in your speech or your talk was brain health as far as water intake and also fasting. How that is that?
Great questions. Water I leave out because it's pretty well understood, pretty straightforward. If you're chronically dehydrated, you're not just damaging your brain, you're damaging your body, right? That is an all-cause mortality issue, right? You can have the best diet in the world. If you're chronically dehydrated, you're going to have multiple system organ failure. So not just your brain, and it's acting bidirectionally, right? So yes, hydrate efficiently, especially if you're highly physically active. You're going to have health issues, and it's pretty apparent, right? If you're chronically dehydrated, your doctor is going to pick up on those signs pretty quick, and that's a much easier thing to intervene on, right? Drink more water. And sorry, the second half of that, fasting. So, fasting is extremely interesting because I think it has a lot to do with the decisions we make around eating, right? But it's also very dependent on your lifestyle, right? If you're an Olympic athlete, you're probably not doing a lot of fasting. You're going to be an absolute outlier across health markers, right? And so it's difficult to study the benefits of it because basically your dietary intake is going to depend on your lifestyle, and whether or not fasting for long periods is going to be beneficial to you is going to vary a lot from person to person. Again, talk to a dietitian, talk to a doctor. Your specific circumstances may point away from fasting as a health benefit. They may point towards the benefits of fasting. That there's so much individual variability in what your lifestyle is that it can be really positive for some folks. It can also be really negative for some folks where they just completely crash out, they stop exercising, and then they're not getting the benefits from fasting. So it's complicated. Talk to your doctor. Yeah.
Dr. Ross, thank you for your talk. Is there any connection or correlation between long-term use of marijuana and early onset dementia or dementia in general?
Boy, that is a great question. And it's of particular relevance because we have cannabinoid receptors in our brain. And so there's some really unique aspects to studying its use. Now, up until the last few years, we didn't really have the availability of longitudinal data because it hadn't been used as frequently recreationally until now we're seeing aging adults. The answer is fairly obvious, fortunately. The combustible aspect of taking in cannabinoids is the biggest problem, right? So I don't need to surprise anybody here by saying don't smoke and don't smoke anything. But that's the problem too, is it muddies up the research, right? Is ingesting it via edible formats is not something that was really happening 50 years ago, so we don't have good longitudinal data yet. Again, it's also tricky because cannabinoids don't just contain THC, they contain a whole mess of other compounds. It's very complicated. I would defer that to an expert. Other than that, it's really interesting, but also when you're interpreting research in that domain, keep in mind a lot of the folks funding and participating in that research have vested interests. They want to sell you their CBD products, things like that. So difficult for me to answer that, difficult for folks to independently research that. Other than that, it's very interesting and that the brain does have some specific things that point towards there may be some benefit to some aspects of that plant compound. The problem is the way most people take in that plant compound is very detrimental to your health, so difficult for us to understand from epidemiological data currently. Yep.
Okay, so I see a lot, and I admit to being a little skeptical of it, but at the same time recognize the benefits. You see a lot about, word puzzles and things like that can be good in helping to, it's always advertised as prevent Alzheimer's and such. Yeah. What is the connection there?
Oh boy, this is a complicated one. If they're selling you a product, take it with a grain of salt. So when I brought up the Loma Lindens, right, the Seventh-day Adventists, right, they're not necessarily doing a lot of puzzles. What they are doing is they're using their brain a lot, right? They're working for a long time as doctors, nurses. So they're doing lots of active problem solving, right? And so what I always tell people is find things that are cognitively stimulating that you enjoy. It's the same recommendation we make around exercise, right? You can't prescribe the same type of exercise to every person, right? Due to a number of different factors. And if it makes you miserable, you're not going to stick to it. You're not going to do it, right? Same with cognitive stimulation. If puzzles aren't your thing, that doesn't mean you're going to get Alzheimer's, right? It just means you need to find something else that gives you cognitive stimulation that's challenging, but watch the line of frustration, right? If you're trying to engage with things that are cognitively stimulating, but you hate doing it and it makes you miserable, do something else. Don't force it. So specific brain games and things like that, do not go out of pocket because you think you're staving off Alzheimer's disease. Find something that's challenging, difficult for you. Even attending something like this on a regular basis is cognitively stimulating, right? Discussion, challenging yourself, all those things are good for your brain. We know that. But specific prescribed, this type of puzzle or that type of puzzle. If you love crosswords, do your crosswords. If you love Sudoku, do those. If they make you miserable, find something else. That's what I tell people. Yeah.
Hey, Dr. Ross. Great presentation. Leads to so many questions, which obviously would be fair to everyone. I want to put a choice to you. I have a leading question that's more germane to your specific presentation versus the more abstract, deeper level question that's related to your general area of expertise. Which would you rather tackle?
Oh gosh, the second does pique my interest, but I may not be able to answer it thoroughly depending on what it is.
All right, well, let's go with the deeper, more theological
sure.
kind of aspect of the question. So, a lot of, there's a big contrast often between atheists and theists, specifically, especially Christians, on the existence of the soul and the spirit versus materialism in atheism is the only choice you have. That right. In that case, everything you are is in your body. Your brain would be the entire source of you as your personality and everything else. Obviously, the body plays a huge role regardless. But based on your specific knowledge and expertise and everything you've learned, is there any strong evidence to you about the workings of a soul in Christian circles versus, is there explanatory power without that, just from what's currently known about the brain? How much of that might be conjecture versus more established fact, for lack of a better word?
Well, let me rephrase this to you. Are you asking, is there evidence of the existence of a soul within the brain tissue?
Not necessarily
Okay.
existence of a soul in the brain, but more lack of the ability to explain aspects of a human purely on a physical basis.
Right. That's.
Can we do it on a purely physical basis, just the brain, or is there really, a lack of knowledge there that suggests that perhaps there is more?
Correct on that second half. Yeah. There is certainly more that I would imagine is probably beyond human understanding when it comes to defining the soul. Is there a specific soul center of the brain? We do know that when engaged in worship and prayer, specific regions of the brain light up. That's not specific to Christianity necessarily, but all forms of, what we do know is religion good for your brain? And this is a complicated topic, right? And this is something that everybody on their own time should research. The answer is religion is good for your brain. What drives that is people who have religion tend to have a stronger sense of community than those who don't. That is probably not the entirety of the picture. And without delving into really theoretical stuff, I would just say do some more research on that topic. In terms of the existence of a soul being supported by modern neuroscience, complicated, right? I think we're probably more likely to find that answer in the realm of philosophy than neurology, but it is certainly interesting, and there's some really cool functional MRI studies of people's brains engaged in powerful spiritual experiences that may point towards something actually being in there. I would just say it's complicated, and anytime you delve into the more philosophical aspects of brain functioning, it gets a little muddy, but it's still very interesting. So I would just say, worth looking into. If you want a keyword, functional MRI, religion, spirituality, you'll see some fascinating stuff in that realm. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. I appreciate so much you especially emphasize the importance of nutrition.
Yep.
Because it's so simple.
It really is, right?
We overlook it because of marketing and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So two things real quick, if you make some comments, your commentary on that. In our way of having convenience, you also see a lot of additives into milk. Right. A lot of milks have omega-3 or omega-3.
Omega-3s, okay, yeah.
Different milks that have additives and stuff for cereal, say high in fiber, blah, blah, blah. So your commentary about those, I figure it might be sort of along the way of supplements. But, maybe there might be, if y'all done any studies or your own thing about, maybe, a basic milk product, having some additives, if that could be sort of beneficial. The other thing is about gluten. If there's any role of gluten also in maybe island gluten or just even our normal pattern gluten, of also making our grains and snaps sort of sticky.
Right. Gluten's a complicated one because a lot of gluten sources in Western diets are clearly problematic, right? White breads, all sorts of things that are clearly bad for you. However, places where you have access to heirloom wheat that has gluten, it's also very good for you, right? So a simplification of it is in the West, people who are going on gluten-free diets oftentimes are getting a healthier diet depending on where you live, what's available to you in terms of produce. That may not necessarily be the case. So again, and where this gets really tricky is we can have a whole debate here about the existence of food deserts. And so there are folks who generally are challenged to do what I recommend, which is eat diets rich in fresh, local fruits and vegetables. Do the best you can, right? And in some cases, going gluten-free may be the best option because the gluten sources in your region are just not good. In other cases, some of those folks in blue zones, they're eating a good amount of gluten. However, the source of that gluten is a healthy plant product. I'm forgetting the other part of the question. Oh, the additives in milk. Boy. Some additives are there for a reason. So things like preservatives aren't necessarily the end of the world. I would say if the option is eating a mildly processed fruit or vegetable versus not eating it at all, I would take the risk associated with that. Other than, in general, the purer the plant product, the better. Yeah, that's a good rule of thumb to stick by.
I have a question about sleep. On the clock, I usually get about 7 hours of sleep.
Great.
But then I usually wake up and go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and sometimes, maybe at least once a week, I lay there for a while afterwards saying, oh, why can't I go back to sleep? Would taking a little melatonin or something like that be helpful or not?
I'll defer the melatonin one because that is very complicated. When you take it, how much you take it varies a whole bunch from person to person. Some folks benefit from it significantly. Some folks are doing more harm than good. So talk to your doctor about that. What I will say about the part you brought up of you wake up and your mind is, you're not able to get back to sleep, right? That is something you can work on with a therapist or counselor. And that's what a lot of people don't understand, is they think therapy or counseling is reserved for people with severe trauma, severe depression, severe anxiety. Even if you're a happy, healthy person, if you consistently have a hard time falling asleep and staying asleep, talk to a therapist or counselor. The number one evidence-based way to get better quality sleep, assuming you don't have obstructive sleep apnea, is something called CBTI. It's a form of cognitive behavioral therapy that helps you change the way you think and changes your approaches around sleep beyond just sleep hygiene, right? Sleep hygiene is not an intervention. I don't know if folks are familiar with that term. That's the idea, oh, get all the electronics out of the room, dim the lights, and everything will be fine. It's more complicated than that. There's a lot of thinking and behavior around sleep that it's a good idea to work with a therapist or counselor on. Typically, it's also covered by your insurance. Talk to your doctor about any sleep difficulties you're having. Some short-term psychotherapy with a focus on sleep can have significant benefit on that issue you're talking about. They'll give you some specific techniques to slow that thinking down when you're staring at the ceiling going, why can't I fall back asleep? Right? And I always tell people, even a couple counseling sessions can make a huge difference in that. So that would be my answer. Talk to your doctor about that. Yeah.
So we're going to make this the final question. I know a couple other people have other questions. So after we finish, I'll come back up and close. If you have a question, then please feel free to go up to Dr. Ross, and he'll be happy to answer that.
Yep.
To you personally as soon as we're finished, but no pressure. Last question.
So why do you why would you? Do you guys, so when you guys test for like brain and stuff, why are you guys usually doing rodents like you said in this?
Why do we use transgenic rodents to study this? Because it's much easier to be uniform in the way we study it. Because, like I mentioned, when it comes to the brain degenerating in certain ways, it's usually not just Alzheimer's disease in isolation. There's so much differences in lifestyle factors. It's very difficult to study this in humans. Whereas the benefit we get from using transgenic rodents is these are uniform. We know exactly what stage they're at in their degeneration, and we know exactly the fact that they haven't been exposed to things that come up throughout the lifespan of an adult. Not just your diet, your alcohol use, your lifestyle, your exercise. Very difficult to conduct research on human beings with Alzheimer's disease, whereas in rodents and animal models, we can say definitively these are all relatively the same. Now we have hundreds of rats we can study rather than 2 to 3 human beings who are going to be very different and present in different ways. So yes, transgenic rodent research is vital to finding a cure for not only Alzheimer's disease, but a number of disease processes. And if you want to get active and do something in your community to make sure that this research continues to go on, talk to your politicians about this. This is crucial. If we want to beat and find anything to get in the way of slowing this down in the definitive way, we need those transgenic rodents. And the budgets for this research just got destroyed by unfortunate nomenclature confusion. It's very, very sad, very unfortunate. Yeah. But it was a little bit of a tangent, but hopefully that answered your question.
Dr. Ross, thank you very much.
Of course.